I'd like to ask you if you think that the Internet as a source of news has any chance of really breaking the deadlock that you so well spoke of in your book, Manufacturing Consent, and continue to speak about.
The Internet has been of tremendous value in education and organization, and in going around the framework of sort of doctrinal control that comes from the main institutions. That's happened here. Most of the activism of the past years has been Internet-based. Take, say, the World Social Forum, which is completely without precedent. It's a huge international movement aiming at a more just global justice, a more just international economic and social political arrangements. 100,000 people showed up in Porto Alegre, Brazil last year, representing great numbers of people throughout the world, almost entirely through Internet interactions. You can't find anything about it in the main media. The opposition to the multilateral agreement on investments, which was strong enough and powerful enough to get the main states to back off from it, was Internet organized. Other countries have done even more. The overthrow of the Suharto dictatorship in Indonesia was substantially based on Internet communication among students and others. Not a lot of people had Internet access there, but enough so that they could get around the dictatorial controls and help create a popular movement which overthrew the dictator. In South Korea, there was just a remarkable demonstration of democracy through the Internet in their last election. South Korea happens to be a very wired-up country, I think probably more than any in the world per capita. And through the Internet, it was possible to develop what amounted to alternative media that broke the media monopoly, helped organize and bring people together in support of the candidate who actually won. South Korea can teach us some lessons in the way democracy should work. This was a real achievement, and it's something that is a model for others. On the other hand, we should also bear in mind that the Internet is it's got many facets. It's also a method of coercion and domination. It's also a source of a lot of fantasy. You can put up anything you like on the Internet. Good thing, but it has its negative aspects. You have to read what you find there with critical caution and skepticism.
Falls Church, Virginia.
Hi, my name's John from Falls Church. It's a real pleasure to talk to you, Brian and Mr. Chomsky. I've got 3 quick points that I'd like to comment on. One, is he familiar with the Bible code, and is there any truth to that? 2, comment on how the Republicans can take sayings like a rising tide lifts all boats and imply that tax cuts help the poor when if you really think about the analogy, you have rowboats that are owned by the yachts, and they're claiming that but when they get richer, that the rowboats are going to rise, and if the rowboats represent minimum wage, they've actually sunk. And the third is solution to Israel-Palestine, a state carved between Egypt and Israel, from the Gaza Strip to the inlet on the other side, just equal amount of land from each side, from Israel and Egypt, buy out the land, and provide a Palestinian state. What do you think of that? Thank you.
Well, on the Bible code, you got to make your own judgment, but I don't put any credence in it. On the rising tide lifting all boats, that's really vulgar propaganda. I mean, it's exactly as you said. It's just the opposite. The tax cuts are targeted for the benefit of the rich overwhelmingly. The chances that it'll even stimulate the economy are very, if you want to stimulate the economy, you don't put money into the hands of the wealthiest part of the population. You put money into the hands of the poorer parts of the population who'll spend it. and that'll stimulate investment and so on. It's not a stimulus to the economy. It's a gift to the wealthy. And to call it the propaganda that's behind it is disgraceful. On Israel-Palestine, the idea of a one-to-one land swap does make sense, but if you take a look at the map, the proposal that you made isn't going to work. There's no way of making a land swap on the Egypt-Israel border that would mean anything. It wouldn't do any good for Gaza, and the main Palestinian population is in the West Bank. That's where they live. That's where they have a right to live, at least. You know, they have other claims which they've mostly abandoned, but at least the 22% of the mandatory Palestine that is in the West Bank should be effectively theirs, maybe with some land swaps along the border. But Israel did offer a little piece of the Negev, cutting it out, as a gesture in the Clinton-Barack offers, but that was meaningless. If you looked at where it was, it didn't mean a thing.
Phoenix, go ahead, please.
Yes, I really disagree with your comment about United States sanctioning or determining Israeli policy. It seems to me and to most Americans that with the $3 billion in aid that we give to Israel every year and the $3 billion in military dollars, and then now recently with $11 billion loan that taxpayers have agreed to, that Israel has basically got us by the short hairs. Right now with AIPAC and JINSA giving money to the congressmen, they can't turn around and vote against these things. So you have all this money that's going to Israel. It turns around and gets used by the military complex to buy weapons for Israel, and United States citizens losing control of their congressmen, because if they vote against these things, then they get put like Jim Moran, being ostracized for stating the truth. Then you have a situation where you have the Pentagon controlled by Wolfowitz and Pearl and Doc Zackheim, who have $800 million missing in appropriations, that Americans feel helpless in terms of how money is being given to Israel, spent for the benefit of Israel, and then you say that we control Israel. I think you got it entirely backwards. I'd like your comment about that.
Yeah, well, it's a topic I've written about a lot, and I won't try to run through it. But there has been a debate for some time as to the sources of U.S. What's called U.S. support for Israel. I don't even like that phrase. I think it's very harmful to Israel. But U.S. support for Israeli expansion and militarism, that's what it is. What are the sources of that? Well, you know, one theory is what you described. It's the lobbies and the influence on Congress and so on. My view is that the record doesn't support that. What it shows, I think, and I've tried to give the evidence for this in print, is that the U.S. relationship to Israel has very closely tracked the conception of Israel as what's called a strategic asset for the United States. I can't run through the record now, but I think if you look through it, you'll find that as Israel was regarded as part of effectively the part of the U.S. system for dominating Middle East oil resources, which is the main concern, insofar it was recognized as an asset for that, connections with Israel increased. So in 1958, for example, the U.S. intelligence, for the first time, called for more support for Israel because on the grounds that, as they put it, a logical corollary of our opposition to Arab nationalism is support for Israel as as a reliable base for U.S. power in the region, alongside of Turkey and at that time Iran. These are the so-called peripheral states that oppose Arab nationalism. In 1967, U.S. support for Israel shot up, but that was not because of effects on Congress. It was because Israel performed a major service to the United States. It destroyed the center of Arab nationalism, namely Nasser's Egypt. which was regarded as a threat to the oil-producing monarchies and to U.S. domination of the region. Okay, Israel wiped it out. Aid to Israel went way up. And I think the record continues like that. By now, Israel's become virtually an offshore U.S. military base. A lot of, as you mentioned, a lot of the money that goes to Israel comes right back to the United States in military equipment, in high-tech industry, and by now they're just very closely integrated as highly militarized societies based on heavily on high-tech military industry. By now, Israel has military forces which, according to their own army, the IDF, the air and armored forces are larger and more advanced than those of any NATO power outside the United States, though it's a tiny country. But that's because it's effectively an offshore military base for the United States. And I think when the United States has not wanted Israel to do something and has told them so, they always back down. The lobby goes away, has little effect. But it's arguable. I mean, there's evidence on both sides, and I suggest you pursue it.
Boston, you're next.
Yes, my question is in regard to the Green Party. I understand Noam is a supporter. Would that be true? Or in general, in the 2000 election? Or?
Yeah, I'm a supporter in principle. I had my own view, if you're asking how I thought people ought to vote in the 2000 election, is that I was supported what was called at the time tactical voting. I mean, in states like Massachusetts, where the outcome was clear in advance, I think it made sense to vote for the Green Party as a way of building up an alternative and ultimately important organization in the political life of the country. In states that, if I had been voting in Florida, I would have voted against Bush because I thought there was enough of a difference between the candidates to want it not to go to Bush and the Republicans. So it's a support, but yes, mixed.
Barstow, California. You're on the air. Barstow, go ahead.
Dr. Chomsky, I wanted to ask how you can possibly turn to the UN as some source of moral authority. It seems to me I don't see how it could be regarded as anything other than a totalitarian instrument of the same corporate elites that you claim, whose interests you claim to oppose.
Well, the UN is, first of all, the UN, remember, can do nothing beyond what the great powers, primarily the United States, allow it to do. So it operates within a framework set by great power interests. Nevertheless, it does represent a wider range of interests and concerns than any particular country. I don't say it's a moral authority, and I've never called it that, but the UN can become, and to some extent has been, an important and effective instrument for doing many good things in the world. It cannot do so beyond the limits of what the great powers will permit.
I have a stack of emails here, and we're running out of time, and if you don't mind keeping the answers short, I'll try to get through a bunch. Bob Feldman thought you might be interested in asking MIT Professor Chomsky, one, is it true that the 12th largest recipient of U.S. Air Force war research contracts in 1999, MIT also provides him with office space for his literary work?
I don't know if it's the 12th largest, but it's certainly a big military contractor. So, for example, in the 1960s, when I was very active against the war and involved in direct resistance, facing jail, in jail, and so on, I was actually 100% funded by the Pentagon. In fact, MIT altogether, if I remember the figures, was about 90% Pentagon funded or something like that. And it's undoubtedly still a substantial, much less than that, but a substantial military contractor. Also, there's some bookkeeping questions. So MIT administers laboratories, which are full-time Pentagon laboratories. But whether it's 12th largest or not, I can't tell you.
This is from San Francisco, and I'm sorry about the pronunciation. It's UMayor, it looks like. I'm curious as to what Professor Chomsky's reaction was to hearing that President Carter was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize.
Well, I don't think that the recipients, the Nobel Peace Prize, is a very mixed story. In the case of Carter, what he was offered the prize for is what we should be asking about.